The flight attendant scanned the first-class cabin, her eyes locking onto two siblings sitting quietly in their seats. Something in her expression shifted, suspicion, doubt, before she marched over. "You need to move. Now." The girl blinked, confused. "But these are our seats." The attendant's tone sharpened. "I don't think so." Passengers turned their heads, whispers spread, and within minutes, security was called, and the two were forced off the plane, humiliated, confused, and unaware of one crucial detail. Their father owned the airline, and when he found out, the flight attendant wouldn't just regret her mistake, she'd wish she had never made it. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Let's get started. The airport hummed with activity as passengers hurried toward their gates, voices blending with the constant announcements overhead. Two siblings, Amari and Zaire, stood near the boarding area, their first-class tickets gripped tightly in their hands. Amari, 17, checked her phone one last time, making sure everything was in order. Zaire, 12, shifted excitedly beside her, his backpack hanging loosely over one shoulder. "How long until we board?" Zaire asked, rocking on his heels. Amari glanced at the screen above the gate. "Any minute now," she said, tucking her phone into her pocket. Their father had booked them first-class seats, something they weren't used to, and she could tell Zaire was excited about the experience. When their group was called, they moved toward the gate, handing their passes to the attendant, who barely looked at them before waving them through. The moment they stepped onto the plane, Zaire's eyes widened. The first-class cabin was nothing like the crowded economy seats they had sat in before. The space, the plush seats, the quiet, it all felt surreal. "Whoa," Zaire whispered, his gaze darting around. Amari smiled, nudging him forward. "Come on, let's find our seats." They reached their row, placing their bags carefully in the overhead compartment before settling in. Amari adjusted the seatbelt across her lap, while Zaire reached for the window shade peeking outside. A few rows ahead, Ms. Calloway, the flight attendant, moved through the aisle with a polished smile, greeting passengers as she checked seat assignments. She was tall and composed, with a uniform pressed to perfection, her posture straight and authoritative. But as she reached Amari and Zaire's row, her steps slowed. Her eyes flickered with something unreadable before she tilted her head slightly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "Are you sure you're in the right seats?" Amari looked up, confused. "Yes, these are ours." She pulled out the tickets and handed them over. Ms. Calloway took them, her gaze scanning the details. Her expression didn't change, but her grip on the tickets tightened slightly before she handed them back. "This is first class," she stated, as if they didn't already know. Amari nodded. "Yes, we know." Ms. Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. "Who booked these seats for you?" Amari inhaled slowly, feeling Zaire shift beside her. "Our father did," she said evenly. Ms. Calloway didn't move for a moment, as if deciding something. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Zaire leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Why did she ask that?" Amari exhaled. "I don't know." Minutes later, Ms. Calloway returned, this time with Mr. Hensley, another flight attendant. He was older, with silver-streaked hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. He stopped in front of them, clearing his throat. "We need you both to step out of first class for a moment," Mr. Hensley said, his tone neutral but firm. "We have to verify something about your tickets." Amari felt her stomach tighten. "Verify what? We already showed them." "It's just a quick check," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Please come with us." Zaire's excitement from earlier faded, his fingers curling around the armrest. "Why do we have to move?" he asked in a small voice. Ms. Calloway folded her arms. "We can do this the easy way, or we can call security." The way she said it, like a warning, like a threat, made Amari's chest tighten. She could feel the stares now, the way passengers had started paying attention but remained silent. No one said a word in their defense. Amari forced herself to stay calm. She grabbed their bags, nudging Zaire to follow. He hesitated but obeyed, his head lowered as they walked down the aisle. The whispers trailed behind them, but not a single voice spoke up for them. The moment they stepped off the plane, the doors shut behind them. A uniformed security officer stood nearby, watching them closely, as if they were a problem that needed to be handled. Amari pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she scrolled to her father's number. Zaire stood beside her. His shoulders slumped, his excitement from earlier completely gone. She pressed the call button. "Dad," she said the moment he answered, her voice unsteady. "They just kicked us off the plane." Silence. Then her father's slow, measured response. "Who did?" Amari turned her head slightly, watching as Ms. Calloway and Mr. Hensley reboarded the plane, leaving them behind. Her jaw clenched. "The flight crew," she said quietly. There was another pause, but this time it wasn't confusion or shock. It was something else, something colder. "Stay where you are," her father said, his voice unreadable. "Don't speak to anyone. I'll handle this." Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what he was going to do, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not even close. Amari lowered the phone from her ear, her fingers still gripping it tightly. She turned to Zaire, who looked up at her with worried eyes. His shoulders were slumped, his hands clutching the straps of his backpack. "What's Dad gonna do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amari exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "I don't know, but I don't think they're ready for it." The airport terminal felt different now. The same place that had been filled with excitement just moments ago now felt cold and unwelcoming. Other passengers walked past them, their expressions neutral, uninterested in the two siblings who had just been thrown off their flight. A uniformed security officer stood near the gate, arms crossed, keeping watch as if they had done something wrong. Amari resisted the urge to glare at him. They hadn't caused any trouble. They hadn't raised their voices. They had simply sat in their assigned seats. And yet here they were, standing outside the plane while their first-class seats remained empty. Zaire sighed and sat down on one of the chairs near the window, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. Amari remained standing, her mind racing. Their father, Darius Holloway, was a patient man, but she knew him well enough to understand that there were certain lines people couldn't cross. And this was one of them. A few minutes later, Amari's phone vibrated in her hand. It was a message from her father. "Dad, flight number? Gate number? I need names." Amari quickly typed back the details, her heart pounding. She knew her father's calm tone didn't mean he wasn't furious. It meant he was thinking, calculating. He wasn't the kind of man who yelled or made threats. He handled problems with precision, and when he moved, people listened. She put her phone away and glanced back at Zaire. "Dad's handling it." Zaire nodded, but she could tell he wasn't convinced. "Are we getting back on the plane?" Amari hesitated before answering. "I don't know." Zaire sighed again, kicking his feet slightly as he stared out at the planes on the tarmac. "I didn't like how they looked at us," he muttered, "like we weren't supposed to be there." Amari's hands curled into fists at her sides. He was right. Ms. Calloway hadn't looked at them with suspicion because of their tickets. She had looked at them like they didn't belong, like she had already made up her mind about them the second she saw them. Minutes passed in silence. Then, just as Amari was about to check her phone again, the gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom. "Paging Ms. Calloway, please report to the front desk immediately." Amari's eyes snapped toward the gate. Zaire sat up straighter. "What do you think that's about?" Amari didn't answer, but deep down she already knew. Something was happening, and Ms. Calloway had no idea what was coming. Ms. Calloway smoothed the front of her uniform as she approached the front desk, her usual composure intact. She didn't like being summoned like this, especially over the intercom, where passengers could hear. It made it seem like she had done something wrong, and she prided herself on maintaining control in every situation. When she reached the counter, Mr. Denton, the gate supervisor, was waiting for her. His expression was unreadable. But there was something in his stance, rigid, professional, yet slightly uneasy, that made her straighten her posture. "You needed me?" she asked, keeping her voice light. Mr. Denton nodded but didn't speak right away. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the side entrance where an airport official stood holding a phone to his ear. The man glanced at Ms. Calloway before speaking into the receiver. "Yes, sir, she's here now." Ms. Calloway frowned slightly. "Who's that?" Mr. Denton exhaled, lowering his voice. "We just got a call from corporate. Direct orders from Darius Holloway." The name hit her like a cold splash of water. She blinked. "Excuse me?" Mr. Denton's lips tightened. "Apparently those 2 kids you removed from first class, their father owns this airline." For the first time in years, Miss Calloway felt unsteady. Her grip on her clipboard tightened as she processed what he had just said. Darius Holloway. Not a high-status frequent flyer, not some executive's friend. The owner of the airline. Her stomach twisted. Mr. Denton continued, his voice carefully measured. "Mr. Holloway is personally involved now, and he wants an explanation. Immediately." Ms. Calloway felt her heartbeat pick up. This wasn't just a passenger complaint. This was a career-threatening mistake. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay composed. "It was a simple misunderstanding," she said quickly. "I had reason to believe their seats were a mistake, so I followed procedure and asked them to step out while we verified." Mr. Denton cut her off with a sharp look. "Did you verify first, or did you assume?" The question hit her harder than she expected. Ms. Calloway opened her mouth but found no immediate answer. Mr. Denton sighed, rubbing a hand over his forehead. "They're still waiting in the terminal. Mr. Holloway's private office just sent new orders. You will personally escort them back onto the plane, and you will issue an apology in front of the passengers." Her breath caught. "What?" "You heard me," he said, voice firm. "Corporate is watching this now. The last thing this airline needs is a discrimination scandal. You will fix this." Ms. Calloway swallowed the lump in her throat. She had been in control of this situation just minutes ago. And now she had been reduced to cleaning up her own mess. She forced a tight smile. "Of course, I'll take care of it." But as she turned to head back toward the terminal, her mind raced. Passengers had witnessed her throw Amari and Zaire off the plane, and now those same passengers were about to see her bring them back. For the first time in her career, she wasn't the one with the power, and she hated it. Amari sat stiffly in the waiting area, arms crossed, her phone resting in her lap. Zaire fidgeted beside her, his sneakers tapping lightly against the floor. He had been quiet for the past few minutes, stealing glances at the gate where passengers continued to board like nothing had happened. She could still feel the stares, the silent judgment. No one had stepped in when they were told to leave, but now that they were still sitting outside the plane, people were beginning to whisper. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up immediately. "Dad, stay put. They're coming back for you." Her eyebrows pulled together. "Coming back?" Before she could type a response, a familiar clicking of heels made her stomach twist. Ms. Calloway appeared, walking toward them with a forced, tight-lipped expression. Her usual confidence was still there, but there was something else now, something she was trying hard to mask. Zaire straightened in his seat. "She looks mad." Amari let out a slow breath. "She should be." Miss Calloway stopped in front of them, clearing her throat. "Miss Holloway, Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice strained. "There has been an oversight." Amari narrowed her eyes. "An oversight?" Miss Calloway's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes. After reviewing the seating arrangements, we have confirmed that your tickets are, in fact, correct. You are welcome to return to your first-class seats." Amari didn't move. She studied Miss Calloway's expression, watching the way her fingers curled slightly against her palm, how her shoulders held just a little more tension than before. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even embarrassed. She was just angry that she had to stand here and say these words. Zaire glanced between them before leaning closer to his sister. "Do we have to go back?" Amari looked at him, her heart squeezing at the way he sounded so unsure. Like the excitement he had felt earlier had completely disappeared. She turned back to Ms. Calloway. "We'll go back, but I want to hear you say it." Ms. Calloway's expression twitched. "Say what? You assumed we didn't belong there." Amari's voice was calm, steady. "I want to hear you admit it." The silence around them was heavy. Ms. Calloway's fingers twitched slightly, but she forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "I misjudged the situation." "That's not what I asked," Amari said. Ms. Calloway inhaled sharply, looking over her shoulder toward the gate desk, where Mr. Denton was standing with his arms crossed, watching her every move. She clenched her jaw before turning back to the siblings. "I made an assumption," she said through her teeth, "and I was wrong." Amari let the words hang between them before finally standing, grabbing her backpack. Zaire followed, adjusting the straps on his shoulders. As they walked back toward the plane, Ms. Calloway leading them through the gate, Zaire glanced up at Amari. "She didn't mean that," he muttered. Amari gave a small nod. "I know." And that's what made this even worse. The walk back to the plane felt different. Amari and Zaire weren't the same two passengers who had boarded earlier, excited and unaware. Now every step felt heavier, as if they were carrying the weight of what had just happened. Ms. Calloway walked ahead of them, her posture stiff, the back of her uniform still perfectly pressed. She didn't look back at them, didn't acknowledge them beyond the forced apology she had been made to give. As they reached the jet bridge, Amari noticed how the flight attendants near the entrance stiffened when they saw her and Zaire returning. The tension in their shoulders, the subtle shift in their expressions, it was clear they all knew exactly what had happened. Mr. Hensley stood by the door, arms clasped behind his back. His voice was flat when he spoke. "Welcome back, Miss Holloway, Mr. Holloway. Your seats are ready for you." Zaire hesitated slightly before stepping onto the plane, glancing at Amari for reassurance. She gave him a small nod before following. The moment they entered the first-class cabin, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations quieted, heads turned. Some passengers looked away quickly, pretending to be focused on their books or in-flight screens. Others watched them openly, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Amari's eyes flicked toward their empty seats. They were exactly as they had left them, untouched, waiting. Miss Calloway cleared her throat, stepping aside stiffly. "Please take your seats." Amari and Zaire walked past her without another word. Amari settled back into her window seat, adjusting her backpack beside her. Zaire sat down more hesitantly, his hands gripping the armrests. The silence felt suffocating. And then, out of nowhere, a voice. "It's about time," an older man muttered from across the aisle. Amari turned her head slightly. The man, dressed in a tailored suit, shifted in his seat but didn't meet her eyes. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to Miss Calloway. She stiffened but didn't respond. Another voice, softer this time, a woman seated a few rows ahead. "They should have never been asked to leave in the first place." Miss Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time since they boarded, Amari saw something flicker across the flight attendant's face, something that looked a lot like embarrassment. She turned sharply on her heel and walked toward the front of the cabin without another word. Zaire let out a slow breath. "That was weird," he muttered. Amari kept her gaze forward. "She's not in control anymore," she said simply. And for Ms. Calloway, that was the worst part of all. Ms. Calloway disappeared toward the front of the cabin, but Amari knew she wasn't far. The way she had walked off so quickly, the tension in her shoulders. It was obvious she was struggling to hold herself together. This wasn't just about being forced to bring them back. This was about losing the control she had assumed was hers. Zaire fidgeted beside her, adjusting his seatbelt even though the plane hadn't moved. He still looked uneasy, his fingers tapping against the armrest. "Are we really just supposed to sit here like nothing happened?" he muttered under his breath. Amari didn't answer right away. She could still feel the stares, the weight of everyone's curiosity pressing in on them. The same passengers who had ignored them when they were thrown off the plane were suddenly interested now that they were back. A flight attendant, Hannah, her name tag read, approached cautiously. She was younger than Ms. Calloway, her expression unreadable but not unkind. She hesitated before speaking. "Would you like anything to drink before takeoff?" she asked, her voice softer than the others had been. Zaire didn't say anything, but Amari could feel how tense he was. She glanced up at Hannah, narrowing her eyes slightly. "Did you ask everyone else that when they first sat down?" Hannah's expression flickered, but she didn't look away. "No," she admitted. "I didn't." Amari let the silence hang between them before finally answering, "Water. For both of us." Hannah gave a small nod and walked away. Zaire turned to his sister, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you ask that?" "Because she wants to make things right," Amari said simply. "But she didn't do anything when it mattered." Zaire frowned, sinking further into his seat. He hadn't even touched the in-flight screen in front of him, something he would have been excited about an hour ago. His excitement had been stolen, replaced with a quiet understanding that Amari hated seeing in his face. She checked her phone, her father's last message still on the screen. "Stay put. They're coming back for you." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but before she could type a response, the intercom crackled to life. "Ms. Calloway, please report to the cockpit immediately." Zaire straightened in his seat. "Again?" Amari's grip tightened around her phone. She didn't know what was happening up front, but she had a feeling Ms. Calloway's problems were only just beginning. Ms. Calloway's heels clicked sharply against the floor as she made her way to the front of the plane. She could feel the weight of every step, her pulse quickening. The captain never called her to the cockpit unless it was serious. She reached the door, exhaled slowly, and stepped inside. Captain Rowe, a man with years of experience and little patience for nonsense, was seated in his chair, his expression unreadable. Beside him, the first officer kept his eyes on the controls, though the tension in the air made it clear that he was fully aware of what was happening. The in-flight phone sat on the center console, the call still active. Ms. Calloway swallowed hard. "You asked for me?" Captain Rowe didn't look up at first. He pressed a button on the phone, switching it to speaker. A deep voice filled the small space, calm, controlled. "Ms. Calloway, this is Darius Holloway." Her breath caught in her throat. There was no mistaking the name. Everyone in the airline knew who Darius Holloway was. His name carried weight, more than any executive, more than the CEO. He was the owner, the man who built this airline from the ground up, the man whose children she had just humiliated. Captain Rowe leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Mr. Holloway has a few questions for you." The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Ms. Calloway's palms were damp as she clasped them in front of her. Darius Holloway cut her off. "Did you verify my children's tickets before asking them to move?" Her throat tightened. She hesitated. "I was following protocol." The silence on the other end was deafening. Captain Rowe's jaw twitched. He was watching her, waiting. "That's not what I asked." She swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry. "No, sir." Another long pause. "So, you assumed they didn't belong in first class?" The words weren't loud. They weren't accusatory. But they held a weight that made her legs feel weak. "I misjudged the situation," she said quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. Darius Holloway let out a slow breath. "And did you question any other first-class passengers the same way?" She felt her stomach drop. Her silence was enough of an answer. Captain Rowe shook his head slightly, his disappointment clear. Darius spoke again, his voice carrying no anger, just certainty. "Ms. Calloway, you will personally ensure my children receive the service that every other first-class passenger is given. You will publicly apologize to them in front of the cabin, and when this flight lands, you will explain yourself to the executive board." Ms. Calloway's hands trembled slightly. "I understand." "Good," Darius said, his tone final. The call ended with a soft click. Captain Rowe leaned forward, adjusting his headset. "You heard the man?" he said, not bothering to hide the disapproval in his tone. "Now fix your mistake." Miss Calloway nodded stiffly, turning on her heel and stepping out of the cockpit. Her heart pounded as she made her way back through the first-class cabin. Passengers watched her now, some pretending not to be interested, others openly curious. She reached Amari and Zair's row and stopped. Every part of her wanted to just walk away to avoid this moment entirely. But she couldn't. Not this time. Taking a deep breath, she spoke, forcing her voice to remain even. "I need to apologize," she said, "to both of you." Amari didn't look up right away. She ran her fingers along the edge of the armrest, her expression unreadable. Zair, however, was watching her closely. "I made an assumption," Miss Calloway continued, choosing her words carefully, "and I was wrong." Silence. Zair shifted in his seat, glancing at Amari. Amari finally turned her head, meeting Miss Calloway's gaze. "Are you apologizing because you mean it?" she asked quietly. "Or because you got caught?" Miss Calloway felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent years in control, years setting the rules. And now, for the first time, she realized she had no power here. She swallowed hard. But she had no answer. And Amari knew it. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Miss Calloway stood there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her lips pressing into a thin line. She had issued the apology, but Amari's question still lingered in the air, unanswered. Zair shifted in his seat, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. He glanced up at his sister, waiting to see what she would say. The tension in the cabin was palpable. A few passengers tried to act as if they weren't listening, but their occasional glances made it obvious. Amari tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Well?" Ms. Calloway inhaled, forcing herself to remain composed. "I was wrong to ask you to leave," she said, carefully choosing her words. "I should have verified your tickets before making any assumptions." "That's not what I asked," Amari said, her voice quiet but firm. Ms. Calloway's fingers twitched slightly. She had always been the one in control, the one setting the tone in situations like this. But this wasn't like any situation she had ever handled before. She had removed these two kids from their seats without a second thought, and now she was being forced to acknowledge it. Zair finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Would you have done the same thing if we looked different?" Ms. Calloway's throat went dry. She didn't have an answer to that. At least not one she could say out loud. Amari watched her carefully, her sharp eyes catching the flicker of hesitation in Ms. Calloway's expression. That was all the confirmation she needed. "You can't even say it," Amari murmured, shaking her head slightly. Ms. Calloway felt her stomach twist. She had spent years believing she was always right, that her decisions were unquestionable. But now, standing here under the weight of Amari's gaze, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Doubt. Her job required quick thinking, gut instincts. She had always trusted her ability to read people, to spot issues before they became real problems. But today she had been wrong. And not just about a seating issue, she had been wrong about them. Miss Calloway cleared her throat, glancing around the cabin, as if hoping for an escape. But there wasn't one. Not with the passengers watching, not with the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. "I should not have judged you," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "I was wrong to assume you didn't belong here." Zair blinked, looking up at his sister. Amari studied Miss Calloway's face, reading between the lines. The words had been spoken, but there was still something hesitant about them. "Okay," Amari said simply. Miss Calloway frowned slightly. "Okay?" Amari nodded, leaning back in her seat. "Yeah. You said what you needed to say. I don't need anything else from you." Miss Calloway's stomach sank at the dismissal. She had expected anger, had even braced herself for further confrontation. But this quiet, collected response was worse. It meant she had already lost. Zaire turned to Amari. You don't want her to say more? Amari exhaled slowly, her fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. It's not about what she says now. It's about what she does next. Ms. Calloway felt her throat tighten. Amari didn't want words. She wanted proof. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment longer before nodding stiffly. If there's anything you need during the flight, she said, her voice more subdued now, please let me know. Neither of them responded. Ms. Calloway turned and walked away, her steps lacking their usual sharpness. As she disappeared down the aisle, Zaire let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He leaned closer to his sister. Do you think she meant it? Amari was quiet for a moment. I don't know. Zaire sighed. I still don't feel right sitting here. Amari turned her head slightly, watching the passengers around them. Some still stole glances in their direction, while others looked away quickly when she met their gaze. The energy had shifted, but she wasn't sure if it was guilt or just discomfort. She glanced out the window, watching as the last of the bags were loaded onto the plane. Her phone buzzed in her lap. Dad, everything taken care of? Amari typed back. Me. She apologized, not sure if she meant it, but yeah, we're back in our seats. The dots appeared almost immediately, showing he was typing. Dad. Good. Sit tight. This isn't over yet. Amari's stomach fluttered. She had a feeling he didn't mean that for her. Ms. Calloway thought this was the worst of it. She was wrong. Ms. Calloway moved briskly toward the galley, her mind racing. She had delivered the apology, done what was required of her, and yet the unease in her chest hadn't disappeared. The feeling of control slipping from her grip was foreign, unsettling. She had spent years in this role, commanding the cabin with authority, ensuring everything ran exactly as it should. But today, she had miscalculated. She reached for a cup, pouring herself some water with slightly shaky hands. The sound of footsteps behind her made her tense. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Hannah, the younger flight attendant, leaned against the counter, watching her. You okay? Hannah asked, her tone carefully neutral. Ms. Calloway stiffened. I don't need your concern. Hannah raised an eyebrow. It didn't sound like they accepted your apology. Ms. Calloway shot her a sharp look. That's not your business. Hannah tilted her head slightly. Isn't it? She crossed her arms. Look, I don't like getting involved in things like this, but I have to ask. Did you even check their tickets before pulling them out of their seats? Ms. Calloway's fingers tightened around the cup. She didn't answer. Hannah scoffed, shaking her head. You didn't, did you? Ms. Calloway turned to face her. I made a judgment based on... Based on what? Hannah cut in. On how they looked? The words stung. Ms. Calloway opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Hannah exhaled, shaking her head. You know, you made them feel like they didn't belong. That kid, Zaire, he looked excited to be here when they first boarded. Now he won't even look up from his seat. She let the words settle before adding, That's on you. Ms. Calloway swallowed, something uncomfortable twisting inside her. Hannah sighed and pushed away from the counter. You might have fixed this flight, but this isn't over for you. You know that, right? Ms. Calloway said nothing. Hannah gave her one last look before walking back toward the cabin, leaving Ms. Calloway standing there, gripping the edge of the counter. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she'd ever feel in control again. Back in first class, Amari glanced at Zaire. He had barely moved since Ms. Calloway left, his fingers tapping absently against the armrest, his expression unreadable. You okay? She asked softly. Zaire hesitated before shrugging. I don't know. Amari sighed, leaning her head back against the seat. Dad's handling it, she reminded him. Zaire nodded slowly. Yeah. But will it change anything? Amari was about to respond when the intercom crackled again. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're preparing for takeoff. Flight attendants, please secure the cabin. Zaire straightened in his seat as the plane began to taxi. Amari glanced around, noticing that the energy in first class still felt different. People had seen what happened. Some passengers seemed to pretend like nothing had occurred, but others stole quiet glances in their direction. The man in the suit across the aisle cleared his throat. "For what it's worth," he muttered, his gaze focused ahead. "That never should have happened." Amari turned her head slightly. But it did. The man looked uncomfortable, nodding stiffly before returning his attention to the screen in front of him. Amari didn't say anything else. The plane lifted off the ground, but the weight in her chest remained. As they ascended into the sky, she glanced at her phone. Another message from her father had come in. "Dad, we land in 3 hours. I'll be waiting at the gate." Amari's grip tightened around her phone. She didn't know exactly what her father had planned, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the last conversation Ms. Calloway would be forced to have today. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane steadied in the sky, but the tension in first class had not disappeared. Amari sat upright, her fingers idly running along the edge of her armrest, her mind stuck in a loop of what had just happened. Zaire had barely touched the in-flight screen in front of him, which was unusual. Normally, he'd be excited to scroll through the movie selection, but now he just sat there, staring out the window as the clouds rolled past. She could still feel the weight of the silence around them. The passengers who had witnessed everything were pretending to be occupied, yet their stolen glances gave them away. It was funny. When she and Zaire were forced off the plane, no one had said a word. But now that they were back, it seemed like everyone had an opinion, even if they were too afraid to say it aloud. A flight attendant appeared beside them, but it wasn't Ms. Calloway. It was Hannah. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked gently, her eyes flickering towards Zaire before landing on Amari. "Or anything to drink?" Zaire shook his head without looking up. Amari hesitated, then exhaled. "Just some water for him," she said. Hannah nodded, quickly stepping away. She returned moments later with a glass of water, setting it down carefully on the tray in front of Zaire. He muttered a small, "Thanks," but still didn't lift his head. Hannah lingered for a second, as if debating whether to say something more. Finally, she spoke in a quiet voice. "I'm really sorry about what happened earlier." Amari raised an eyebrow, studying her carefully. "Are you saying that because you mean it? Or because you saw how things played out?" Hannah didn't flinch. "Because I mean it." Amari gave a slow nod. "Then why didn't you say anything before?" Hannah swallowed, shifting slightly. "Because I've seen things like this happen before, and I've always told myself it wasn't my place to interfere." She looked down, exhaling. "That doesn't make it right, though." Amari didn't respond. She just watched Hannah for a moment before turning to Zaire, who was finally sipping from his water. "You work with her, don't you?" Amari asked, bringing her gaze back to Hannah. Hannah nodded. "Yeah. She's been here longer than I have. A lot of people don't question her decisions." "And what about you?" Hannah hesitated before saying, "I used to be one of those people. I'm not anymore." Amari tilted her head slightly. "Why?" Hannah let out a slow breath. "Because today, I saw how it looks from the other side." Amari leaned back in her seat, considering that. At least Hannah was being honest. That was more than she could say for Ms. Calloway. Hannah straightened. "If you need anything, just let me know." Amari nodded once. "Thanks." Hannah walked away, and for the first time since reboarding, Zaire finally turned to Amari. "You believe her?" he asked. Amari sighed. "I don't know. Maybe." Zaire pressed his lips together. "At least she said something." "Yeah," Amari muttered, "but she only said it when it was safe to." Zaire didn't respond, but the meaning in Amari's words lingered between them. The flight continued, the minutes dragging on. Amari checked her phone, scrolling absent-mindedly through messages from friends who had no idea what had just happened. Zaire eventually pulled up a movie but wasn't really watching it. Then, suddenly, an announcement came over the intercom. "Ms. Calloway, please report to the cockpit immediately." Amari's eyes snapped toward the front of the cabin. Zaire frowned. "Again?" Passengers exchanged glances, some shifting in their seats. Even Hannah, who had been passing out drinks a few rows ahead, stopped mid-step. Amari folded her arms. Dad must be handling things already. Zaire blinked. But we're still in the air. Exactly. They watched as Ms. Calloway stiffly made her way toward the front, disappearing behind the curtain leading to the cockpit. The moment she was gone, whispers rippled through first class. A few passengers leaned toward one another, murmuring under their breath. Some looked toward Amari and Zaire again, but this time their curiosity was different. They weren't just staring at two kids who had been removed from their seats. Now they were staring at two kids whose father had enough power to summon a flight attendant mid-flight. Zaire turned toward Amari, his eyes wide. "What do you think's happening up there?" Amari smirked slightly. "I think Ms. Calloway just realized this is a lot bigger than she thought." And for the first time since they boarded this flight, she felt the balance of power shift. Ms. Calloway's breath felt heavier as she stepped into the cockpit, the door shutting behind her with a quiet click. The enclosed space suddenly felt much smaller than usual. Captain Rowe sat in his chair, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The first officer kept his focus on the instruments, though the stiffness in his posture made it clear that he was aware of the situation unfolding behind him. But it wasn't the captain's silence that made Ms. Calloway's stomach twist. It was the voice coming through the speaker of the in-flight phone. "Ms. Calloway," Darius Holloway's voice was calm, controlled, but there was a weight to it, an authority that made the air feel heavier. "I assume you now understand exactly how badly you miscalculated today." Ms. Calloway forced herself to stay composed. "Sir, Don't bother," he cut her off. "I'm not interested in excuses." Her jaw tightened. Captain Rowe leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked on her. "Corporate has already been informed of what happened. Mr. Holloway has requested an immediate review of your conduct upon landing." Ms. Calloway felt the blood drain from her face. "A review?" Darius's voice returned. "I own this airline, Ms. Calloway, which means when a situation like this happens, I have the authority to ensure it's handled properly. And believe me, it will be." Ms. Calloway gripped the edge of the nearest seat for support. "Sir, I acknowledge my mistake, but Do you?" Darius asked. "Because I have reports from passengers, your fellow crew members, and even the captain that suggest you didn't think it was a mistake at all until you were forced to correct it." Captain Rowe watched the color drain from her face. "Ms. Calloway," he said, his voice quieter but firm, "you didn't just embarrass two passengers. You embarrassed this airline." Ms. Calloway felt her throat tighten. Darius let the silence stretch before continuing. "You didn't question any other first-class passengers. You didn't stop anyone else to check their tickets, just my children. I wonder why." She knew exactly why, and worse, she knew that he knew exactly why. Her fingers clenched into fists at her sides. I wasn't thinking." Darius's voice remained steady. You were thinking. You just weren't thinking correctly." Ms. Calloway's hands were ice cold. Captain Rowe sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Holloway, what would you like us to do before landing?" "She will personally see to it that my children receive the highest level of service for the remainder of this flight," Darius instructed. "Not because I care about their comfort. They already know they belong in first class. But because I want the rest of the passengers to see what it looks like when someone is forced to acknowledge their mistake." The humiliation burned in Ms. Calloway's chest. "And upon landing?" Captain Rowe asked. Darius's answer came without hesitation. "Security will be waiting for her at the gate. She will be escorted directly to the executive office, where she will explain herself to the board. If her explanation is unsatisfactory, she will no longer be employed by this airline." Ms. Calloway's stomach lurched. "Sir, please, This conversation is over," Darius said. A click echoed through the cockpit as the call ended. Ms. Calloway stood there, frozen. Captain Rowe exhaled and turned toward her. "You should get back to the cabin," he said. "I suggest you make good use of the time you have left." Ms. Calloway nodded stiffly, though her legs felt weak beneath her. As she stepped out of the cockpit, She could already feel the weight of the passengers' stares waiting for her on the other side. For the first time in her career, she had no control over what came next. Back in first class, Amari scrolled through her phone, her expression unreadable. Zaire had finally picked a movie to watch, but she could tell he wasn't really paying attention. Passengers whispered, their gazes flickering toward the front of the plane, waiting to see what would happen next. And then, Ms. Calloway emerged. She walked slowly down the aisle, her expression carefully composed. But Amari could see it in her posture, the stiffness in her movements. This wasn't the same woman who had stood in front of them earlier, demanding they move. This was a woman who had just realized that for the first time in a long time, maybe ever, she was on the other side of the power dynamic. She reached their row and stopped. Silence stretched. Zaire glanced up, shifting uncomfortably. Ms. Calloway inhaled sharply, then spoke. "Can I offer you anything? Drinks? A meal? Anything at all?" Her voice was tight, controlled. Zaire looked up at Amari as if unsure how to respond. Amari studied Ms. Calloway's face, the forced politeness in her expression. This wasn't genuine. This wasn't an apology. This was survival. Amari leaned back in her seat, folding her arms. "You didn't ask us that when we first sat down." Ms. Calloway's lips pressed together. "I'd like to correct that now." Amari tilted her head slightly. "Would you be doing this if my last name wasn't Holloway?" Ms. Calloway's face remained neutral, but Amari saw the flicker of shame in her eyes. "No," Amari murmured, answering for her. "You wouldn't." Zaire exhaled beside her, suddenly exhausted. "I'll just take some juice," he muttered. Ms. Calloway nodded stiffly. Right away, she turned, disappearing toward the galley. Zaire sighed, leaning back in his seat. That felt weird. Amari didn't take her eyes off the aisle. "That's because she's not sorry. She's scared." Zaire hesitated. "Is that enough?" Amari was quiet for a moment. Then she shook her head. "No," she said, "but it's a start." As Ms. Calloway returned with the drink, passengers watched her closely, some with quiet amusement, others with judgment. And Amari knew in that moment that Ms. Calloway felt every single one of those stares. For the first time, she was the one being scrutinized. For the first time, she was the one who didn't belong. Ms. Calloway placed the juice down on Zaire's tray with precision, her fingers steady despite the storm raging inside her. She forced a tight smile and turned away quickly, eager to put as much distance between herself and the two siblings as possible. She could still feel the weight of their gazes, Amari's calm, unreadable stare, and Zaire's hesitant confusion. It was a feeling she wasn't used to. She was the one who set the rules, the one who dictated order in the cabin. And yet now she was the one waiting for judgment. As she moved through the aisle, she could feel it. Every whisper, every glance from the first-class passengers. Some of them were merely curious, others seemed smug, as if relishing the fact that she was now the one walking on eggshells. A few, she suspected, had likely done the same thing she had done before, silently judged the two kids when they first sat down, assumed they didn't belong, and only now did they feel guilty about it. She reached the galley, gripping the counter tightly, her breathing shallow. How had this happened? One moment she had been in control, running the cabin as she always did. The next, she had been pulled into the cockpit and forced to answer to the most powerful man in the airline industry, a man whose children she had humiliated, a man who wasn't going to let this go. The truth of the situation sat in her chest like a stone. She wasn't just dealing with a passenger complaint. She was dealing with Darius Holloway. And now security was going to be waiting for her at the gate. The executive board would be waiting for her. She had never been in trouble before, not like this. Yes, there had been minor complaints over the years, passengers who thought she was too strict, too firm, but nothing that ever escalated past a simple written report. She had been untouchable. Not anymore. She squeezed her eyes shut, inhaling slowly. Maybe, just maybe, if she handled the rest of this flight perfectly, if she showed real remorse, the board might show her mercy. Maybe Darius Holloway wouldn't fire her. Her fingers twitched. If. Taking a steadying breath, she straightened her uniform, put on the most professional expression she could manage, and stepped back into the cabin. Passengers noticed her return, but she ignored them, forcing herself to focus. She needed to get through this flight without making things worse. She needed to be perfect. She moved quietly through first class, checking on passengers. She refilled drinks, adjusted tray tables, and offered warm towels with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She hated this feeling, the uncertainty, the powerlessness. And every time she glanced toward Amari and Zair's row, she could see it, the way Amari was watching her, studying her, as if waiting to see what she would do next. She knows, Ms. Calloway thought bitterly. She knows I'm not really sorry. She knows I just don't want to lose my job. Ms. Calloway swallowed hard and kept moving. Amari tapped her fingers lightly against the armrest, watching as Ms. Calloway moved through the aisle with forced precision. Everything about her posture, her movements, screamed discomfort. She wasn't acting out of kindness. She was acting out of fear. Zair sipped his juice quietly beside her, his shoulders still slightly slumped. The excitement he'd felt before the flight had never returned. The damage had already been done. Amari glanced at the other passengers. Some had gone back to their books and movies, pretending as if nothing had happened. But she caught the way some of them still looked up when Ms. Calloway passed by, whispering amongst themselves. It wasn't just her who had lost control. Ms. Calloway had lost their respect too. Amari checked her phone. Another message from her father. "Dad, landing in 2 hours. Security is set. Sit tight." She exhaled slowly. 2 hours. She wondered if Ms. Calloway realized what was waiting for her when they landed. Zair shifted in his seat. "I kind of feel bad for her," he muttered. Amari turned her head slightly. "Why?" Zair hesitated. "I don't know, she looks nervous. Like she knows she messed up." Amari studied him for a moment. Zair had always been softer than she was, more willing to see the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. "That doesn't change what she did," she said quietly. "I know," Zair admitted. "But what if she really is sorry?" Amari exhaled. "Then she'll show it when no one is forcing her to." Zair nodded slowly, but she could tell he wasn't completely convinced. Ms. Calloway returned to their row one last time. "Would either of you like a blanket or pillow?" she asked stiffly, the words robotic, practiced. Amari didn't answer right away. She just looked at her, really looked at her. The woman standing in front of her wasn't the same Ms. Calloway who had ordered them off the plane with confidence and certainty. That woman had been sure of herself, sure of her authority. This woman knew she had no authority left. "No," Amari said simply. Ms. Calloway nodded, looking relieved to be dismissed. She turned and walked away without another word. Zair sighed. "I still feel bad." "You don't have to," Amari murmured. "She made her choice. She just doesn't like the consequences." Zair didn't say anything after that. Amari returned her gaze to the window, watching as the sky stretched endlessly before them. 2 more hours, then they would land. And for Ms. Calloway, her real problems were only just beginning. The 2-hour stretch in the air felt longer than it should have. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the approach of evening. Most passengers had settled into their seats, some lost in their books, others watching movies or dozing off. The quiet hum of the engines filled the air, but even in the stillness, tension lingered. Amari watched the time tick down on the screen in front of her. The estimated arrival kept adjusting by a few minutes, but the final destination never changed. In less than 2 hours, they would land. And in less than 2 hours, Ms. Calloway would have to face the reality she had spent the entire flight trying to ignore. Zair had finally curled up against his seat, half asleep. He wasn't fully resting. She could tell by the way his foot still tapped lightly against the floor, the way his fingers played with the sleeve of his hoodie. He wasn't at ease. Not really, and neither was she. Her father had told her to sit tight. But Amari knew Darius Holloway well enough to know that whatever he had planned for Ms. Calloway, it wasn't going to be simple. Her father was not a man who acted impulsively. He didn't yell, didn't threaten. He moved in silence and let consequences speak louder than anything else. And right now, Ms. Calloway had no idea what was waiting for her. Across the aisle, a soft voice broke the quiet. "I just want to say, I'm really sorry for what happened to you two." Amari turned her head. It was the older woman from earlier, the one who had spoken up after they were forced back on the plane. She sat 2 rows across, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose, a gentle expression on her face. Amari studied her carefully. "Why are you sorry?" The woman hesitated, folding her hands in her lap. "Because I was sitting right here when it happened," she admitted. "And I didn't say anything." Amari felt her chest tighten slightly. The woman exhaled as if working through the words in real time. "I saw how that flight attendant looked at you before she even spoke. I saw the way she questioned you but not the others. And I knew it wasn't right." She sighed. "But I didn't speak up until after your father got involved, and that doesn't sit right with me." Amari let the words settle for a moment. She had expected apologies from Ms. Calloway, from corporate, even from other airline staff. But she hadn't expected this, an apology from someone who had stayed silent. "You were scared," Amari said simply. "That's why you didn't say anything." The woman's face flushed slightly, but she nodded. "I was." Amari tilted her head slightly. "Scared of what?" The woman hesitated. "I don't know. Causing a scene, maybe. Getting involved in something I thought wasn't my place. Or maybe..." She exhaled, shaking her head. "Maybe I was scared of what it would mean if I acknowledged what was really happening." Amari studied her carefully. She wasn't like Ms. Calloway. There was no forced apology here, no script written out by corporate to save face. This was real. Zaire stirred beside her, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. "What's going on?" The woman turned to him with a small, kind smile. "I was just telling your sister that I should have spoken up sooner." Zaire blinked sleepily, looking between them. Then he shrugged. "Well, you're saying it now." The woman smiled softly. "I suppose that's something." Amari nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. "It is." The woman looked relieved and turned back to her book, leaving Amari to her thoughts. As Zaire adjusted in his seat, Amari caught movement at the front of the cabin. Ms. Calloway had reappeared, but she wasn't moving through the aisle with her usual confidence. She lingered near the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane, hesitating for just a fraction of a second before forcing herself to continue. Her eyes darted toward the passengers but quickly looked away. It was almost like she could feel their judgment, like she knew that her presence had shifted from respected authority to whispered disgrace. She had already been judged in the court of public opinion, and she had lost. Hannah, the younger flight attendant, passed by her, heading toward Amari and Zaire's row. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something almost knowing in her eyes as she approached. "I wanted to check in on you two," Hannah said quietly, offering a small smile. "How are you feeling?" Zaire shrugged. "Tired." Amari studied Hannah for a moment before answering. "Fine." Hannah nodded. "I know today didn't go how it should have." She hesitated, then glanced briefly toward the front of the plane where Ms. Calloway was now pretending to organize the meal trays. "I don't know what's going to happen to her when we land," Hannah admitted, lowering her voice. "But I do know that she's never had to answer for anything before today." Amari tilted her head slightly. "And that bothers you?" Hannah exhaled. "It's complicated." "No, it's not," Amari said simply. Hannah gave a soft, knowing smile. "No, I guess it's not." She stepped back. "Let me know if you need anything before landing." As she walked away, Amari turned toward Zaire, who was watching the exchange quietly. "You think she really means it?" he asked, voice low. Amari considered the question for a moment. "Maybe," she said finally. Zaire was quiet for a moment before nodding. "Dad's gonna fire her, isn't he?" Amari didn't answer immediately. She turned her gaze toward Ms. Calloway again, watching as she moved through the cabin with that same forced grace, her head held high even though everything around her was falling apart. "Yeah," Amari murmured. "I think he is." And for the first time, she wasn't sure whether that was enough. Ms. Calloway wasn't just losing her job. She was losing her reputation, the respect she had built over the years, and that might hurt more than anything. But that was the thing about actions. Once they were done, they couldn't be undone, and Ms. Calloway was finally learning that lesson, the hard way. The final hour of the flight dragged on, thick with tension that never quite faded. Ms. Calloway had retreated to the galley, avoiding unnecessary interactions, likely trying to salvage what little dignity she had left. Amari could feel the shift in the cabin, not just in the way the passengers were reacting, but in the way the crew carried themselves. No one spoke about what had happened, yet it hovered in the air like an unshakable weight. Zaire had finally started watching his movie, though Amari could tell he was still thinking about everything. His fingers drummed lightly against his knee, his mind working even as his eyes were fixed on the screen. He always did that when something bothered him, went quiet, but never stopped thinking. Amari checked her phone again. No new messages from her father. She didn't need them. She already knew what was waiting at the gate. Security, corporate executives, a reckoning. Ms. Calloway thought she had already been through the worst of it. She thought the forced apology and the stares from passengers were the full weight of her punishment. She had no idea. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Los Angeles International Airport. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." Zaire sat up straighter, stretching his arms. Finally, Amari exhaled, glancing toward the front of the cabin. Ms. Calloway had stepped back out, her expression unreadable, her movements automatic as she prepared for landing. She handed out hot towels, adjusted passengers' trays, did everything by the book. But her mind was clearly elsewhere. For the first time in her career, she was uncertain about her future. As she reached Amari and Zaire's row, she hesitated for the briefest moment before speaking. "Tray tables up, please," she said, her voice hollow. Amari didn't move right away. She studied Ms. Calloway's face, searching for something, some sign of real regret, something beyond the fear of losing her job. She found nothing. She folded her tray table up and sat back in her seat. Zaire did the same, though he refused to look at Ms. Calloway. Ms. Calloway lingered for a second longer, then moved on. The plane dipped slightly as it began its final approach. Amari leaned her head against the window, watching the city lights come into view. This was almost over, or maybe, for Ms. Calloway, it was only just beginning. As soon as the wheels touched the ground, passengers reached for their phones, eager to reconnect with the world outside the plane. Amari's phone vibrated almost immediately. "Dad, I'm at the gate." A single sentence, no unnecessary details, no reassurances, just a statement of fact. He was here. Amari turned to Zaire. "Dad's waiting for us." Zaire nodded but didn't say anything. He already knew what that meant. The plane taxied toward the gate, the usual routine unfolding, seatbelts clicking open, passengers shifting in their seats, crew members preparing for arrival. But there was an added layer of tension that had nothing to do with turbulence or delays. Ms. Calloway hadn't moved from her spot near the galley. Her hands were folded in front of her, her posture unnaturally stiff. She was waiting, not for the passengers, not for the paperwork. She was waiting for her fate. Amari checked her phone again. Another message from her father. "Dad, security is already in place. The executives have been notified." She exhaled slowly, slipping the phone back into her pocket. Zaire sat up straighter, stretching his arms as he prepared to exit. "You think she knows what's coming?" Amari glanced toward Ms. Calloway. "Oh, she knows," she murmured. The fasten seatbelt signs switched off and passengers began gathering their bags. The energy in the cabin was different now. Some were in a rush to leave. Others were deliberately waiting, wanting to see what would unfold next. Then came the real moment of truth. The doors opened. A uniformed security officer stepped inside, standing just past the jet bridge. He wasn't blocking the way, wasn't making a scene, but his presence alone was enough to cause a stir. Passengers glanced between him and Ms. Calloway, murmurs starting up again. Ms. Calloway's face drained of color. She knew. She had assumed, hoped, that she would be allowed to handle this quietly, that maybe she could explain herself in private. But Darius Holloway didn't do things quietly. This wasn't going to be a meeting in some back office. This was going to be a statement. As first-class passengers began gathering their things, the security officer stepped forward. "Miss Calloway," he said, his tone polite but firm, "you need to come with us." Passengers froze. Ms. Calloway inhaled sharply, glancing around as if looking for an escape. But there wasn't one. She was done. Hannah, the younger flight attendant, shifted uncomfortably, her expression caught between sympathy and the understanding that there was nothing she could do. Zaire gripped his backpack straps. "Whoa," he whispered. Amari didn't look away. Ms. Calloway's mouth opened slightly as if she wanted to protest, but no words came out. She was used to being the one with authority. She was used to having the power to dictate how things went. But not today. The passengers who had once looked to her for guidance now looked at her with judgment. The same whispers that had followed Amari and Zaire off the plane earlier were now directed at her. She was the one being watched. She was the one being doubted. And worst of all, she had done it to herself. Captain Rowe stepped out of the cockpit, his expression tight with professionalism. He didn't acknowledge Ms. Calloway directly, but he did nod toward the security officer. "She's all yours." That was it. That was the moment it became official. Ms. Calloway had lost. The security officer gestured toward the jet bridge. "This way, ma'am." Amari watched as Ms. Calloway, the woman who had ordered them off the plane without hesitation, the woman who had once walked through this cabin with certainty, now took the slowest steps of her life. The whispers followed her, just like they had followed Amari and Zaire earlier, except now, no one was looking away. She disappeared through the jet bridge, and just like that, she was gone. The flight attendants pretended to carry on as usual, ushering passengers toward the exit, but the energy had shifted. Zaire let out a low breath. That was intense. Amari stood, adjusting her bag. "Let's go." As they stepped off the plane, the terminal felt almost too bright, too big. But none of that mattered, because standing just ahead, waiting near the gate with an expression that gave nothing away, was Darius Holloway. And as they walked toward him, Amari knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. Darius Holloway stood just beyond the gate, his posture straight, hands clasped in front of him. He wasn't a man who needed to raise his voice or make a scene to command attention. His presence alone was enough. The moment Amari and Zaire stepped off the jet bridge, his gaze softened, but only slightly. He gave them a slow once-over, scanning their faces as if making sure they were unharmed. "Are you both okay?" he asked, his voice steady, even. Zaire shifted beside Amari, nodding quickly. "Yeah, we're fine," Amari exhaled. "We're fine, Dad." Darius studied her for a beat longer before nodding, satisfied for now. But there was something unreadable in his expression, something quiet but sharp, a calculation happening beneath the surface. He turned slightly, looking past them toward the jet bridge. Ms. Calloway emerged, flanked by two corporate executives and the security officer who had escorted her off the plane. She looked smaller than before, her confidence stripped away. Her uniform still pristine, but now feeling like a hollow shield. Passengers exiting the plane threw quick glances her way, their whispers continuing as they passed. A few even stopped nearby, pretending to check their phones just to witness whatever was about to unfold. Darius Holloway didn't move, didn't react as Ms. Calloway was led toward him. She stopped a few feet away, her throat tightening as she forced herself to meet his gaze. There was no mistaking the power dynamic now. Ms. Calloway had spent years deciding who belonged and who didn't. Now she was the one being questioned. One of the executives, Mr. Langford, stepped forward. He was a senior board member, his neatly pressed suit a reminder of the company's upper management. He glanced between Darius and Ms. Calloway before clearing his throat. "Mr. Holloway," he began, choosing his words carefully, "we are prepared to address this matter immediately." Darius didn't acknowledge him at first. He kept his focus on Ms. Calloway, watching the way she shifted her weight slightly, her fingers twitching at her sides. Finally he spoke. "You removed my children from their seats without checking their tickets." His voice wasn't loud, but it was felt. Ms. Calloway swallowed. I made an error in judgment," she said carefully. Darius tilted his head slightly. "An error in judgment." Her breath caught. I didn't." "You humiliated them in front of an entire cabin," Darius continued, his tone still even, controlled. "You made an assumption, not based on their behavior, not based on their conduct, but based on what?" The pause was suffocating. Ms. Calloway's lips parted slightly, but she had no answer. Darius let the silence linger before turning to Mr. Langford. "I assume the airline will be taking immediate disciplinary action." Mr. Langford straightened. "Yes, sir. Ms. Calloway will be placed on administrative leave effective immediately. There will be an internal review, and based on the findings..." Darius held up a hand, silencing him. "No need for a review." Ms. Calloway flinched. "She's done," Darius said simply. The words landed with finality. Ms. Calloway's breath hitched. "Please, Mr. Holloway." Darius's expression remained unreadable. "You had no hesitation when you ordered my children off that plane. You didn't stop to consider if you were making a mistake. You didn't second-guess yourself when you embarrassed them. You were certain. Now so am I." The weight of his words pressed down on her like a crushing force. Mr. Langford nodded stiffly. "Understood, sir." He turned to Ms. Calloway. "Effective immediately. Your employment with the airline is terminated." Ms. Calloway blinked rapidly. But there was nothing left to say. Security stepped forward, waiting to escort her out. For the first time, she was the one being removed. Darius shifted his attention back to Amari and Zaire. "Let's go," he said simply. Zaire glanced back once, his eyes widening slightly as he watched Ms. Calloway being led away. Amari, however, didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The lesson had already been learned. As they walked through the terminal, passengers still whispered, some glancing between them and the scene unfolding behind them. Zaire tugged at Amari's sleeve. "So that's it? She's just gone?" Amari nodded. "She made her choice." Zaire hesitated. "Do you feel bad?" Amari thought about it for a moment. Did she feel bad? Did she feel sorry for Ms. Calloway, the woman who had assumed they didn't belong? The woman who had been forced to face her own judgment in front of an entire flight? She glanced at her father, his expression unreadable as he walked beside them, his presence commanding even in silence. Then she thought about Zaire, how excited he had been when they first boarded, how that excitement had been stolen from him the moment someone decided that he didn't belong. She thought about the stares, the whispers, the silence from the passengers who watched it all happen and said nothing. Finally, she exhaled and looked forward. "No," she said. "I don't." Zaire nodded slowly, as if understanding for the first time that justice didn't always feel like kindness. As they exited the terminal, the air outside was cooler than she expected. The sky had darkened slightly, the city alive with movement. This was over. But it would never be forgotten. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.